A or B?
I think there's a lot more power in silence than in speaking.
Left or right?
It's not my job to make statements. It's my job to ask questions.
Yes or no?
There's a big difference between making no decisions and taking an active decision to do nothing.
Welcome to The Art of Deciding with Bruce Whitfield.
Hello, and welcome to The Art of Deciding. The internet tells us we make around 35,000 decisions every day. But how much do we really know about the process we go through to arrive at those choices? I'm Bruce Whitfield. I'm a journalist and professional speaker, and I talk to decision makers for a living. I get those who spend their lives making big decisions to give us some insight as to how they do it. And maybe, just maybe, it'll help you make better decisions in your life. So, let me take you back to the 1980s, to a high-rise building in the centre of Cape Town, South Africa. It's hot, and a bored young accountant is surreptitiously looking at a business magazine to get him to the moment that he can leave the office and get away from a job that he's really beginning to hate. A name catches his eye.
On the front page of Fortune magazine, it said, Master of Wall Street, John Wolfensohn, the greatest mind on Wall Street. So I thought, well, let me phone this guy and see what he has to say. I'd never heard of him. So I picked up the phone and I said, hello, Mr. Wolfensohn. My name is Brad Fried. I'm phoning from South Africa.
Young Brad Fried made a spur-of-the-moment, rather cheeky decision to ring up the man who had just rescued Chrysler from bankruptcy and was on his way to becoming president of the World Bank.
He started laughing. I don't know why they put me through to him. I think my voice had scarcely broken. People were still calling me ma'am on the telephone. I said, Mr. Wolfensohn, I'm thinking of doing an MBA and I wanted to get some advice. So he said to me, well, why don't you come and visit me in New York and we'll talk about it. I was being sent by Arthur Andersen to Chicago for some kind of a training trip. And I tagged on a trip to New York to go and see this guy. And he was charming. He was lovely. He was receptive, a phenomenally capable, thoughtful man. And he said to me, I know what you want to do. You must go to Wharton. That was a pivotal moment, Bruce, because I then experienced a huge, huge sensation of exposure, of curiosity, of input that I'd never got before. But I owe him the world because I wouldn't have known where to go but for him.
Brad Fried graduated from Wharton with a distinction in his MBA. He joined McKinsey as a management consultant, moved to Investec Bank and became its London chief executive. Then, if that wasn't enough, he was selected to join the board of the Court of the Bank of England. In fact, he was chair from 2018 to 2022, which means now he is Sir Brad Fried. He's chaired Goldman Sachs International for a while and now runs the global interests of Kirsch Industries, a conglomerate with substantial property and food service interests around the world. That decision he made as a young man in Cape Town had a profound effect on the course of his life. But what gave him the courage to cold call one of the biggest names in world finance?
Look at it differently, Bruce. Look at the counterfactual. What's the downside of picking up the phone to John Wolfensohn in New York? The downside, he could say, do me a favor, young man. I'm a busy guy. Never phone me again. So long as you live, never phone me again. I cannot believe you disturbed my day. It's a big deal. What was I doing anyhow that day? Nothing. I was trying to kind of reconcile some cash book against the ledger. I was being shouted at by a manager. I was being told that I'm not allowed to go out at lunch without wearing my jacket. I was trying to work out how to get out of a stock take at some godforsaken supermarket the following weekend. What were the choices? Either I could carry on, do more of that, or I could say I got to break out completely.
The decision-making process then is go big because you have nothing to lose.
100%, always. But always go big, but always be rational and never take a risk where if it goes the wrong way, you blow it all. Putting a risk parameter around it is absolutely crucial in these moments because everything's a trade-off. And I always look at the counterfactual. If I didn't do that, what would the alternative be? People often say, well, how did you get involved in the Bank of England? Why did you get involved in that? So the story there is not dissimilar to the John Wolfensohn story, and that was 12 years ago. So I was 46. I was lying on the couch reading the Sunday Times in my house, and I'd always look out of just sheer fascination at the employment section because there were always interesting things where people were being employed, what they were being paid, what was happening. And I see a thing, the Bank of England were looking for a director. So I cut the coupon.
But what gives you the temerity to cut the coupon out for a director of the Bank of England? Because at this moment you are running Investec Bank in London, and the world is the world falling apart yet? Has the global financial crisis begun yet?
This was in 2010. The world had already kind of collapsed into a bit of a heap. And I'd spent the 3 prior years working quite closely with the Treasury. I'd nationalized a lot of assets and a lot of banks, and I was on the Audit and Risk Committee working with them. So I knew it from the Treasury side, but I didn't know the Bank of England side. But I thought, wow, what an interesting thing this is, because central banking has always been a thing for me. I went through the interview process and that worked out well, and then joined the bank's board. And I felt very comfortable doing that, because how would anybody know that I had an interest in central banking? How would anybody know that I was passionate about it? Nobody would know. I only arrived in England in 1999, still trying to build a network. And I'm 58. I still feel very much like a kind of a work in progress. And I still have very much of an immigrant mentality. And I still feel that I've just arrived. And I still feel I have to make my way and that it's all going to collapse in a heap tomorrow. That's just the way it is. You know, you kind of 1 or 2 steps away from just utter and complete collapse.
But doesn't that then force really deep introspection and very powerful decision-making? Because you're not going to be embarrassed. Nobody really knows you at this stage. You don't have this enormous track record. It's not going to matter as much if you're told no. So therefore, you can decide to go for great heights.
Look, I have maybe been a bit flippant about this question of what I'm good at, what I'm not good at, what I'm capable of, what I'm not capable of. I think extremely deeply about these things. And I think extremely deeply about where I have gaps in my capacity and which gaps I think can be closed and which gaps genuinely cannot be closed. And I forget about those. I don't even try. But when I'm passionate about something, I give it a full go. It's all in, Bruce. It doesn't always succeed. But if it doesn't succeed, what's the big deal? The paradox of this whole thing is that the greater risk is not having taken the risk. You know, I always chuckle at this idea of people who kind of the view that everything you do has to succeed. Well, I mean, the bulk of things I've tried have failed from a degree of just marginal, like a little bit of failure, to kind of some spectacular errors of judgment and some spectacular errors of analysis, and some things about which today I can't even discuss on this podcast. I'm so embarrassed about, and they pain me so greatly. I think about a youthful Brad, or I think about the things that I could have done or said even a few weeks ago, and I think, you know, will I never learn, or will I never get it right, or will I never try harder? You can't say you've arrived. It's complete nonsense. I've never met anybody who's arrived. You know, some people have achieved wonderful things in narrow verticals, but there's a life full of things at which they are no good. And this question of development needs, I think if you've exposed yourself to firms that are really developmentally challenging, you realize that life is just this ongoing process of trying to figure things out and realizing very often how little you know. Very often how little you know.
The counterfactual. The greater risk is not having taken a risk. I suppose it's another way of saying what's the worst that could happen. Make sure that you take that into account, but don't let it stop you. So many of us put off decisions or don't make them at all because we're afraid of the consequences. We put obstacles in our own way. Mistakes are inevitable. Perhaps it's helpful to know that no one has it all figured out. The former chair of the board of the Bank of England has done things even recently he's too embarrassed to talk about, and he still views himself as a work in progress. But he's willing to learn, to fill the gaps in his knowledge. He's decided to broaden his perspective. That's not always the case with people in senior positions. What's behind that choice?
You've got to be honest with yourself about what you value. So in spending so much time at the Bank of England, I was a public servant, right? You don't serve the government. You serve the people of the United Kingdom. You don't earn very much to do that. It's pretty nominal compensation. But what do you earn? You earn a level of intellectual stretch that you cannot get anywhere else in the world. You earn exposure to how to manage through a crisis, because while I was there was the Scottish referendum that led to the Brexit referendum, that led to the Brexit decision-making, that led to COVID, that led to Russia's horrendous invasion of Ukraine. Who else could have taught me that? I saw governments in action, decision makers in action. I value that. So you've got to know what you value and lean into what you value. You've got to know yourself, and as life goes on, really be honest with yourself. You're going to often see people who have cognitive dissonance. They value one thing but act another way. Complete cognitive dissonance. You can't live like that, or I don't think I could live like that.
You are the chair of the Court of the Bank of England. You go in over a period of extraordinary crisis in Britain. In as much as you can tell us about decision-making at that level where you're not setting monetary policy, you have no control over monetary policy, you're in charge of the governance of the bank, but you've got no decision-making power when it comes to raising or cutting of interest rates. Teach us what it was like, what you saw, and the sort of decisions you saw playing out where you could or could not influence.
Well, the starting point is that the cost of having an independent central bank is that central bankers never comment on the politics, never. And in the same way as the quid pro quo is it's not for the government to comment on the decisions of the central bank. The minute you trample those lines, you completely ruin the construct that exists between a central bank and a government. So I have no problem remaining quiet. And that's not because I don't have a view. I think that there's so much power in silence. I think there's a lot more power in silence than in speaking. And I've always believed that. It's not my job to make statements. It's my job to ask questions. People care what I inquire, and they care what path I take them down logically. And they care what decision-making processes happen because I'm connected. They care about that. But what I think should be expressed through others. At the Bank of England, nobody will know what I think unless I'm forced to give a view. The minute you make a statement as a chair, well, where do people go with that? They can either agree or disagree. The power is in taking folk down a path where you have a hypothesis going into a discussion. That hypothesis will either be borne out or not borne out. You don't have a monopoly on knowledge. The whole point of chairing is to get the best out of everybody. And if the best out of everybody can be expressed in a thoughtful way, where at the end of that discussion, the answer pops out either through consensus or through the will of the people, based on a very rigorous set of analyses, based on very thoughtful assumptions that are very well thought out. If you can express yourself through that process, the power is that it's owned by that collective. The minute you make a statement, the only person who owns it is you. You've taken away the ability of people to debate, argue, challenge. People somehow, because you call chair or chief executive, people think that there should be more respect for you. I don't have respect for people because of their position, and I don't expect people to respect me because of my position. It's a complete nonsense. That is the invitation to be challenged. So the key is just to keep quiet, ask questions, and bring the challenge on. When they're yelling and shouting and screaming, and I cannot believe you're saying this, you're not thinking right, that is when I feel extremely comfortable because people are passionate about the outcome. When there is this kind of silent hum with a series of people nodding and agreeing and waiting for a hot lunch to be served, that's when I feel incredibly displaced. The power, I think, of a great collective decision-making process is that the people that come to those decision-making processes, they have to give of themselves in ways that they'd never imagined before was possible because they are forced to give of themselves. The danger of people at the top expressing themselves is that what they do unwittingly is build a softness, a groupthink, but this idea of building in a challenge function and having people understand that challenging a leader is not a right but an obligation.
The art of deciding is not just about ourselves. Deciding is often a group thing. When it comes to collective decisions, Bradfried's art starts with the power of his own silence, because that way, he believes, people will arrive at the right place. Plus, you also need to master the art of disagreement, to harness the power of different angles, different thinking about the same problem. But how does that really work? Can everyone be part of the art?
It's always so hard, because sometimes the hardest people to manage are the people that are most valuable in an organization, the voices that you really don't want to hear. And you think, do I really need to listen? Well, the answer is yes, you do really need to listen. And there will be that moment where you think, the person's crossed the line. Either they've kind of crossed into the realm of complete inappropriateness, or they've crossed into a place where they've become unhinged from reality. That's a collective judgment. You shouldn't make that yourself, because you could be angry with them for coming back the 14th, the 18th, the 23rd time. You've got to test yourself in that moment for bias and for prejudice. But the hardest to manage people are often the most incredible people in an organization, because they stop this groupthink. It's a very delicate judgment. There are those moments where I've asked people to leave where they've been brilliant performers, but culturally they are very misaligned. So for me, cultural misalignment would be when people use the word I and don't use the word we. That is a pet peeve. So when somebody personalizes to such a degree that they forget what they're part of, or they behave in ethically problematic ways, or they forget why they're there for one or another reason, no matter what value they add in an intellectual process, it's time to go. But if they are culturally aligned, that they are difficult is no problem at all. That they are difficult is part of their value. They're adding depth into decision-making and lenses into a problem that if you remove them from that situation, your prism changes. And the minute your prism changes, you stop seeing things for what they are. Any problem worth solving has got multiple solutions. Some are good, some are bad, some are best, some are better. Many are traps. It's like going into a maze. Your best hope of making your way through these mazes and multiple lenses are having multiple views. The question of diversity is not just a question of diversity of attributes, but cognitive diversity.
You come through a fractious meeting. There have been lots of disagreements. There are 3 potential courses of action that could be taken. Each one of them has merits and upsides and downsides. Each one of them is a perfectly acceptable route to take. What is the decision? Who makes that decision?
In those rare occasions, very rare occasions, when there's more than one perfectly plausible route, then I would say, you know what? Why do you even bring it here? Just make the decision, man. Get over yourself. Make the decision. Move on. Don't bring a line decision to a forum when you're looking for that kind of input. Just do it. And if you cannot make the decision, then get out of the way and leave those decisions to people who can make the decisions. The decisions about which I'm talking are typically those situations whereby you've got real dissonance around the outcome, where there is no good outcome. There are only bad outcomes. And the question is, which is the least of the bad? Typically, I find everything incredibly brutally hard. And I find the layers that one has to look at these days just unbelievably difficult.
How then do you lead conversations that have to come to firm decisions in areas where you are uncomfortable, where you cannot predict geopolitics a week from now, never mind 5 years from now, yet the decisions you have to take are 5, 10-year views? You are ill-equipped to make decisions around AI, yet you have to chair meetings where 5, 10-year views are being taken on AI. What is the art of that decision?
The answer is it's always grinding uncertainty. You need to surround yourself with people who are scar tissued enough to make decisions in the face of grinding uncertainty and live with the outcomes and be able to switch hit and make sure that by the time you take a risk in the face of that grinding uncertainty, none of those actions that you take can bite your hand off. You're not betting it all on black. You're not betting it all on red. So you mess it up. So big deal. And you reconvene. You say, hey, guys, you know what? What a shockingly stupid, idiotic decision we made. Let's figure it out and go again. And the collective decision-making around that is more powerful than any artificial intelligence because it's the collective of a group that is okay with making terrible mistakes and dusting yourself up and going again.
Worst decision and why?
I think my worst decisions were probably as a young Investec chief executive. This was when I was, 32, 33 years old when I took that job. I often used to think that the right answers to difficult business questions were changing people. So I'd say this person's not shaping. A shiny new thing will shape things up so well that rather than invest in people, finding new people. And to this day, I live with that pain. And I live with it every time I think about it. It's painful. Every single time I think about it, I can think of the individuals that would have benefited from much more coaching. And coaching that I couldn't provide. I was too young and immature. But coaching that I could have harnessed on their behalf. So I think those were the worst kinds of decisions I've ever made. And I'm now incredibly reticent about moving somebody on. Incredibly.
The importance of the counterfactual, because you've raised that in decision-making. One runs the risk, however, of being so overwhelmed by the many variables and the many what-ifs in the world that one can almost be in a position where you take no decision because nothing seems viable and nothing seems plausible. Yet that's not an acceptable position either, because taking no decision is worse than making a bad decision. Correct?
Correct. But there's a big difference between making no decisions and taking an active decision to do nothing. The active decision to do nothing is not taking no decision. It's taking a decision to let the moment pass, to live with the ambiguity, to live with the pain, to internalize the grinding uncertainty for the time being on the basis that a decision cannot be made at this moment given all the factors. An active decision to do nothing is sometimes an incredibly powerful and difficult decision because everybody has an impulse to act. So when you take a bunch of people who are, fueled to act and paid to act, and you come to the conclusion that actually the best thing you can do is watch the competition do what they're going to do, and you think they're going to blow their hand off and kind of watch them do that. And yes, you're not investing in this at the moment. You'll be a fast follower and a rapid follower rather than a leader. That's also okay. But the idea of doing nothing is a bad one. The counterfactual is a very important thing for me. And personally, if I weren't doing this, what would I be doing? If the team wasn't doing this, what would they be doing? If we did nothing, what would happen? If we did this, what could happen? The counterfactual is absolutely critical in all aspects of decision-making in life.
You don't like summation of meetings. However, it comes to a point where you need to ensure that everybody around the table understands what has been agreed. Because sometimes people can be, having a tough time, have a migraine, worrying about kids' school reports, whatever the case might be. You don't know if everybody's fully engaged. How do you ensure that this group decision-making is as conclusive as you believe it is, because you don't want to impose a view that in any way causes an uncertainty around the group decision? How do you ensure that everybody's got the same point?
So if you are alert to the emotional issues around the room and the body language around the room, you will quickly hone on to the people who are not as connected as others. And it is them that I ask always to summarize what the meeting said. And I'll say, Sally, where are we? What do we think? It's a powerful question. Now she owns the answer and she's had to summarize the meeting. Now, if she summarizes in a way that is different than the rest of the people in that room believe, there'll be a riot. And then we'll keep going. We'll go for another hour. Because what Sally thinks we think is diametrically different than what everybody else thinks we think. And then we keep going. So the only way of getting there is for everyone to own the outcome, and the last person that needs to own it is me.
There's a fabulous book, The Power of Giving Power Away. And that's what you do. People take ownership of the solution and are far more likely to effectively implement that solution in a collaborative way because it is their decision. It is our decision. We are accountable for it. That's powerful.
Absolutely. Look, the greats that have trained me and yelled at me and shouted at me, the real greats have given me rope. Why would I then hold on to it? I've had some of the lousiest managers in the whole world look after me, some of the really most uninspirational, dreadful, kind of humorless characters in the world. And those people have typically given me no power, no decision-making, coaching, no thoughtful feedback. And those dreadfully uninspirational people that I've worked with, they've also formed a hugely important role, because I think about their names and their faces, and I think, what would that person do in this difficult, impossible situation? What would they do? And then I open my eyes and I try and do the opposite, and normally I'm inevitably right.
The counterfactual, the power of silence, the risk of not taking a risk. Brad Fried's, or Sir Brad Fried's, art of deciding. Brad spends his life not only making decisions himself, but also leading groups of very opinionated people in the decision-making process. And, he says, he tries to do most of it by saying as little as possible, mixing views, asking other people to say what they think. It sounds almost too good to be true, but it also sounds like a way of operating that might make a huge difference in so many aspects of our lives, from sitting around the dinner table to governing countries. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Art of Deciding, the podcast where we ask people who make big decisions to reveal a little of how they do it. You'll find us on all the major podcast platforms, so please click follow so that you don't miss an episode. In this series, we ask best-selling writer Lee Child about the decision whether or not to let Jack Reacher live or die, champion poker player Liv Bourrie about the decision that cost her £100,000, and Detective Asbjørn Raklu about the decisions involved in interrogating a mass murderer. I'm Bruce Whitfield, and I talk to decision makers for a living. You can find out more about me at brucewhitfield.com. Till the next time, bye-bye.